So it's lovely to see you. As I say, there's some faces I've not seen for quite a long time. Some people I don't know. My name is Richard, one of the founders of GLA with Elaine. It's lovely to have you here. This subject of vertical OD is something that we've been asked a lot more about recently. I think perhaps for a long time, and we've said this in terms of a number of things we've been developing recently, people are saying, well, we're loving the GLP, we love the impact it can have on leaders and how they lead and how they perceive the world and their worldview and everything. And somehow we want to be able to take that into organizations. We want to see how it can actually shift the system as well as the system within which the leaders are operating. How does that happen? And so we thought we'd take it one stage further today to ask the question, what if we think of organizational development, we all will have our experience of organizational development in different ways, but what does it mean to take a vertical lens on OD? Would that be different again? I'm really chuffed to welcome on our panel two guests today. One is Dan Gresham. So Dan and I met actually, what would it be now? Dan, 7 years ago, I think, something like that. And we were doing, and actually Sally's with us today, who we also did this master's degree with. And the tutor of our master's degree was our other guest today, Jenny. So I'll ask Jenny a bit about that in a minute, because it was a master's degree. It wasn't called vertical organizational development, but it could have been because of the way that we went about it. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But Dan comes to us as Director of Global Learning at Kearney, which is a big global management consultancy, previously many years with PwC. And why I love talking to Dan on this subject is because Dan actually does this in real life. You know, it's he doesn't advise people to do it. He works with the leaders in AT Kearney, actually thinking about how do we shift the system that we're operating in, as well as the leaders changing themselves. So Dan, really looking forward to getting your thoughts in a minute. And Jenny is previously CEO of Schumacher College, Leadership College, working in the sustainability field of leadership particularly, and coach, her real thing is about co-creative leadership and regeneration in business. Jenny's also runs lots of work in the whole field of embodied mapping and constellations. So I'm going to start with you, Jenny. It's lovely that you're here. Perhaps, why do you think the world needed a master's degree? I think we called it you called it from a organizational development from a complexity and systemic perspective. What did that mean, and why did the world need it?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the world needed it because there had been such an emphasis in the West and supposedly developed countries on the individual and the individual's rights, right since the 1960s on until 10 or 20 years ago. People had lost the perspective of the need to be aware of and loyal to the larger systems in which we exist. And that has had a very detrimental effect, particularly on the Earth and the Earth systems, because human beings, in their wish to fill their own individual needs, have in many instances become quite greedy and grasping. And we have the situation that we have now, which is the Earth is in under serious threat. And particularly the balance of the Earth is out of balance and not ideal either for ourselves or for other species. Pretty severe reasons why we need to take a constant attention to the bigger systems in which we're embedded.
Thank you. And the other thing that the other word apart from systemic perspective in the title was complexity. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, probably again similar. A lot of ways that people thought about organizations were quite simplistic. And if you look at models of organizational development, the earlier ones are quite simplistic, and they indicate that organizational development happens linearly. happens in linear stages, whereas some of the most recent ones are more complex, and they show a cycle, which is more true to life, like the natural cycles in life. And they often show a very complex cycle where you get sub-cycles as well. And complexity comes from biological sciences, and it's got something very important to say to us all, really. There seems to be an absolute passion amongst human beings for simple answers to complex issues. So our politicians are the same. They go for giving us simple answers to complex issues. But most of the issues that we face in business, in leadership, in your lives, and in the organisational development field are in fact complex. And we are selling ourselves short when we, as voters and as consumers, are looking for a simple fix. That really doesn't work when the issues are so complex.
Thank you. And Jenny, I'm going to ask you to make another link for us now. This term vertical that we use so often now in the field of adult development. What's the link then between the complexity approach and a vertical lens?
Well, that's a wonderful question, actually, Richard. It's almost coincidental. I don't think it's sequential, but the later stages of individual and organizational development describe individuals and organizations which are complex and which embrace paradox, polarities, and opposites, for example. And that is almost identical to the descriptions of complexity and what is a complex process in the world. So the later stages of our vertical development for individuals and for organizations are simultaneously and synchronistically in tune with the description of complexity science and complex systems. Almost uncannily similar, really.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, that's the way we describe the GLP and the action logic stages. Is it's an evolution or a progression in the complexity of our meaning making, and so it's directly linked in that way too, I think. And as you say, and interestingly as well, as we profile people, one of the things we start to look at the later stages is the whole notion of a systemic awareness, which links to your first point. So we see it very much there too. Yeah. Thank you, Jenny. I'm just going to bring Dan in, if I may. Dan, let's go back to basics, if we may. What is organizational development, and what is vertical organizational development, and how are they different?
Yeah, I don't have definitive answers on this, but just from my corporate experience, I suppose when I think of classic OD, I think of how do you get from an organization from point A to point B? What are the range of interventions we can make along that way, along that path? Typically, as OD practitioners, we've got deep expertise in, say, the social dynamics of change. So we tend to make our contribution in that way to support an organization from point A to point B. It's linear, as Jenny mentioned. It's planned. You can secure budgets and convince people that you're going to get a return on your investment. And it's really important, I think, because of that. You're meeting an organization where they're at, in their language. And I think it's a really important place to start, actually.
I know that you've been on a bit of a journey in Kearney, so perhaps you could share in sort of vertical terms how that's played out in your experience over the last few years that you've been at Kearney.
Yeah, if I think about this vertically, and certainly the way we approached it at Kearney, I joined Kearney 7 years ago, and I came in on a culture change ticket, really, because that was my area of expertise. And we were using learning as a kind of Trojan horse, as a vehicle for change. That was our sort of primary route. I saw Kearney as, quite entrenched in a kind of expert achiever stage, if you like. If I looked at the whole organization, not individuals, but the whole organization, I'd probably say that typically it was in that space. And I wasn't, by the way. I think that's sort of probably an interesting point to make, that, you know, one of the reasons why I left PwC was because I was definitely in that kind of redefining sort of stage of life, and I needed to leave, and I needed a fresh start, and I needed a new canvas to go and paint on, you know. So in I come to Kearney, and I noticed that, you know, straight away. And I noticed that, you know, Kearney wasn't speaking up publicly and making a stand publicly in the world about various things. So certainly part of the programs that we'd put in place were helping people, you know, operate from their best self and to express themselves more fully in the world, you know. And I suppose if I look back on it, I didn't realize this at the time, but if I look back on it, I was helping them. I was sort of almost leading them down the path of what it might be, coaxing them down the path of what it might be to be more redefining in the world. And for sure now, Kearney is much more public about various things out there in the world, you know, Black Lives Matter, or, you know, the US elections, or the war in Ukraine. It takes a stand and it speaks publicly about this in a way that I think starts to look and feel a lot more like an organization that's more in that redefining terrain, I'd say. But the way we approached it, I think what I wanted to say was, and this, I don't know if this is vertical OD or not, I think it is. We were deliberately, I was thinking of OD as breathing life into the organization, you know, and all of the programs that we put in place, yeah, of course, it was helping people get their job done well, yeah. But actually, we designed it in such a way that, you know, these really were places and spaces where real wholehearted connection happened, week in, week out, all around the world, all around our global network. So I always pictured these programs that we put in place as sort of the beating hearts of the organization. You know, at Kearney, people are spread quite thinly around the world, largely connected by technology, jumping on a plane occasionally to go see a client. So when they came on these week-long programs, you know, they're all flooding into one location, you know, to live and learn together. And I really did think it was almost like we were oxygenating the system, and off they'd go again, you know. And I really had no idea what they were going to go off and do. I mean, I could paint a story of, yes, you know, we've achieved certain organizational outcomes, sure. But all sorts of weird and wonderful things happened off the back of, you know, oxygenating these folk. And I think another part of the work that we did, which was super important, was to work with what came out of that afterwards, you know, to almost expect the unexpected and work with the unplanned, and all sorts of things happened. I could tell you 1,000 stories, you know. I remember 4 women on one program who wanted to start a women's network across Europe and the Middle East because of what happened on one of the programs, you know. And we thought, wonderful, let's support that, nurture that, you know. OD didn't stop at that point.
Jenny, I know you've worked with lots of organisations over the years in this area, and how do you explain? You started talking about it earlier in terms of models of change, but how do you see this vertical OD differing, and why does that matter?
Well, I think that I would agree with Dan. It's important to start where people are, and not just do that as a trick, but to do it with real respect. Wherever we are is where we are truly, and that needs to be respected. So I would often come in and talk about more conventional models of organisational development. And then when there's a sort of match between the group's understanding and what I'm bringing, I will stretch a little bit and actually introduce the ideas of more complex models of organisational development. And I find that that works really, really well. Whereas if you dive bomb in with your newer ideas, you usually miss people and therefore don't get that sort of match and connection, and then the very good generative dialogues.
I just wanted to pick up one other thing with you, Dan. When we were talking about this, preparing for this the other day, you talked about another element that comes with this later stage of vertical development, and that is a sense of purpose, and also how global organizations now are having to think in terms of stakeholder management, not just shareholder management. Perhaps you could say a little bit about that and Kearney.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? If you go back to an organization needing to go from point A to point B, you know, who defines success? You know, what is success? Who defines it? And when you get there, then what? And so what? And how long does this go on for? You know, where are we taking this? What are we actually facilitating here, if you like? What are we nurturing? So for me, purpose is a great idea, concept that can sit right at the heart of this to nurture an organization for sure. And if you take a step back from an organization and see that it is completely entwined with every other entity and organization and system out there, including, as Jenny quickly pointed out, you know, the natural world. You know, we start to ask questions along the lines of, well, in what way is this organization serving something beyond itself? And for sure, this is a hot topic right now. I know it is in the coaching community, but it's definitely there at the most senior levels in the corporate world as well now. You know, even 3 years ago, we led a series of dialogues at the World Economic Forum around shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism. I remember there was also in the US something called the Business Roundtable, where I think we've got something like 180 chief executives of corporate large organizations who declared in writing that shareholder primacy is a thing of the past, you know. And I'm not naive. I know it's not all pretty and we've not got it all right, far from it. But just those very declarations tell me how important it is, even from a corporate perspective, from corporate leaders, to start to ignite and activate purpose within organizations. It's one thing defining it, it's another thing activating it and living and breathing purposefully, you know, every day.
We talked about the fact that sometimes as soon as you put vertical development in the foreground, that eyes glass over and you lose your client. And so we struggled with how to have it in the background and yet shaping the way the engagement goes. And two thoughts that had come to mind. One is that often helping the client articulate the tensions they experience and then reframe them as paradox often is an opportunity to start with where they are. And the other element was something that Bill Torbert and Elaine and Richard talk about often, that 3 key levers to move from one stage of adult development to another are how we deal with feedback, how we deal with power, and how we deal with time.
Yes.
And almost always those 3 are, one may be more in the foreground, time, for example. But those are almost always sources of pain that can be a way in.
One thing that Tyler was talking about there was this question of to what extent do you put it in the foreground, the developmental theory in the foreground. And actually, those of you that have been on our different workshops and certainly on the OD workshop, you'll know we talk about this idea of scaffold and spotlight. So when do you want developmental theory to be in the forefront, in the spotlight, and then when do you want it to just be in the scaffold, that it's maybe influencing the whole way that you're designing your intervention, but you may never mention the words action logic or developmental theory or whatever. And perhaps the best example of that, actually, and most of you have come across the transformation cards that Bill and Elaine created with CCL, and with those cards, you can do it in two ways. You can take someone's leadership journey from here to there, so from 10 years ago to now to the future, and never mention that the cards actually have action logics assigned to them. Or you can actually bring in developmental theory as much as you want to. And so we think that that's a really helpful distinction to say scaffold and spotlight. And that's kind of what you're picking up there, Tyler. You know, sometimes you may want to make very specific reference to it. At other times, actually, it's just there in your thinking. And the people who are experiencing it don't need to, and probably would not benefit from having it explained to them in that moment. There's a question come up in the chat. You mentioned the analysis you've done of, I don't know, 40 or more models of change. And the questions come up if you could mention one or two of the newer circular models, or I would talk about emergence.
Yes,
plan.
I do have one on the tips of our fingers, and that is one that was invented by Ralph Stacey and Patricia Shaw. And that is absolutely a circular model. And it's probably no coincidence that they are both writers on complexity. So they were looking, they couldn't find a model that really, in their opinion, represented complexity. So they came up with their own model. So that's the one that I've put immediately in front of you. The theory U is sort of developed by Otto Scharmer, who's a lecturer at MIT, and a very world famous organizational consultant. And one of the reasons I would equate theory U with the circular models is that it shows this shape, a U shape, and that is very like the shape of the trough between waves. So it is a natural shape, and it's an iterative shape. You don't get one trough between waves, you get many troughs between waves. So I think it's contributing to that iterative complex modeling and biomimicry modeling itself on natural cycles. It also is quite strong in saying that if an organization wants to transform, it needs to go through these different stages on the U process. And the stages are co-initiating, which pretty much speaks for itself. Then co-sensing, that's quite unusual. It's the idea that the people involved need to actually spend time in a situation, observing the situation and feeling it with all five senses. And then it goes down to the bottom of the U, and this is the most challenging bit of all. It says that we need to go through a stage of presencing where we listen both individually and collectively, if we're in an organization, to the small voice inside us which guides us at quite a profound level. Now, a lot of organizations, they prefer to jump from the top section, from co-initiating to co-embedding into the organization. So the idea that we actually have to go through a transformative journey that goes as deep as that is extremely interesting. But because it has huge credibility, I've done lots of work with theory U in organizations, and many organizations are hungry for it, I think. Down at the bottom of the U, they say what the organization has to do if it really wants to transform is decide what it needs to let go of in order to let the future come.
Do we start with the individuals on programs and so on, or do we have to start with the organization as a whole in order to bring this kind of transformation about? Or do you have to go in with both?
Both at the same time, I guess. I suppose there's something here about I'm still left with helping the organization, get with the messy. And we do need to create, we talk a lot about psychological safety, don't we? We do need to create conditions for people to get into presencing, you know, in that way, and get with the messy. And to give them permission that this is part of the learning process for sure. And I think that can be really personal, actually. So that's certainly work that starts with self. But I think the power of community, you know, to support that is vitally important. So, I mean, we've done this in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways, but through all of our programs and the rest. But I can't help but think that we need to look to the arts more for learning how to get with the mess. So music and dance, you know, the world of improv, improv comedy, all of this, I think really helps folk understand that it really is okay to get with the mood of the moment, you know, and act sort of responsibly from that place. So yeah, I mean, that's starting with self for sure. And I think once we get into a place where the permission is there and people feel like the conditions are there, then we can start presencing into the wider system around us for sure. And again, we certainly do that in quite profound ways, actually, on our programs. Like you said, Richard, you know, your team, the wider firm, you know, the societies that we live and operate in, you know, and presencing into that to then start to, as Jenny was talking about, talk together about what is our response in respect to those arenas for sure. And then I think you can get into true sort of community dialogue and practice. And that's when it gets super exciting, super powerful. As I know I'm sure many of you have experienced this, I'm sure many of you have led this, but it can get very powerful at that point. And we often talk, certainly at Kearney, in those moments about, you know, when we're talking about the firm, the company, you know, there's always an aha moment of, we are the firm here in this room. So we've, you know, coined the phrase at Kearney, and it's known in the language of Kearney, the firm in the room. You know, we are the firm in the room right now, how we're showing up right now together on this Zoom call together, you know. That is our culture right now.
But thank you for the questions. I'm conscious that we're a minute or two over, but I do just want to very quickly mention three things. On our next webinar, it's going to be on the 4th of October. It's this question going back to the individual development. Why is the movement from late achiever into early redefining such a key transition for leaders in organizations? And why does it matter to organizations? And the answer is it's because so many of the leaders in organizations will be at this stage. What does that shift mean? And how do we deal with it? So that's what we're going to be talking about in October. For those of you, a lot of you I know on the call have already joined us for one of our certification or foundation workshops, but we have another one starting in October. So if you haven't done that, then please come and join us. This will give you the chance over 8 or 9 sessions to have a real deep dive into what is this developmental theory all about? What's action inquiry? What's this GLP that GLA has? And if you want to, that can also lead to certification in the GLP. And then finally, Jenny's mentioned it a couple of times, but we do also run this certification program in vertical organizational development. So we've just set some dates. Don't think I've even had a chance to check them with Jenny yet. These are some dates at the beginning of next year when we'll be going and doing a much deeper dive into a lot of what we've been talking about today. But for now, just it remains, I think, to thank you all for coming, for your energy and interest. Thanks to Sarah and Alison for what they've done, and of course to Dan and Jenny for your fantastic contributions, and Karen as well. So thank you all for coming, and hopefully see you next time.